Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today to our remembrance and celebration of the Deaf President Now movement at 30 years. This is the third in our series of panels. I hope you've been able to attend our previous two. We've been eagerly looking forward to this panel. The topic you see in front of you on the screen. First of all, there are so many people to thank for bringing this to bear. The student body government and graduate student associations are sponsoring this panel. And we'd like to thank all of them for their generous support. Also, our second panel had Dick Moore as part of the panel. And he was generous enough to have taken leftover posters from the printing of the Washington Post, gathering all of the articles about DPN, and released those here. And last but not least, we must thank Dr. Bobby Cordano, and I'd like to invite you up to share a few remarks. President Cordano? I must also recognize your dedication to this event, Billy. Thank you so much. Deaf history is so vital to all of us. As teachers, as those of us look back to the events of those days and how they still apply today, this panel is the most excellent reminder of the import of that event. Without you, those who are not present with us today are also invited to join into the panel by looking at the Facebook live streaming of the panel. Deaf President Now movement can be seen through two lenses, both that of a civil rights movement and a civil rights movement that has already been in existence across the country for people of many races. And so we are looking at the intersection of these civil rights movements, that of the civil rights movement of deaf people and of race. And so we're delighted to have these panelists with us today. And I must remind everyone here, if you're not aware, Dr. Glenn Anderson is with us, who will be receiving an honorary degree, an honorary doctorate for who received that honor in my first presidency for a graduation. We also have with us Dr. Kajid Rashid with us to share her experience. I want to tell all of you how much I'm looking forward to hearing your perspectives on the movement. And I hope that all of us can take away from this some greater learning and understanding of our work here at Gallaudet University. And that the notion of understanding ourselves merely as deaf people is not enough. We must look at the multiple intersections that exist in the world and look through multiple lenses. We must learn as much as we can from our panelists today about how all of these different areas of lived experiences within our community connect and intersect, where they diverge, where connection is possible and where it may not be. We look forward to learning from your wisdom, your vision for all of us. Thank you so much for being part of this discussion today. Thank you for taking your time and for joining us.
Greetings, everybody. All of you know, when I say greetings, I very much expect a response, so thank you very much. I do want to let you know that we have these panelists here who are now in their 15 minutes of fame because we are streaming on Facebook Live, so make sure you smile big. Okay. We very much do welcome the panelists. Bobby did steal some of my thunder on this in introducing a number of you. That's right. We do have Glenn Anderson with us, who did trustees. Yes. And we are also joined by Dr. Joseph Hill, who was a student here, and now he works at NTID, RIT. We also have Dr. Angel Romas, who was a student here as well. And now he is at the Hawaii School for the Deaf. I know all of us would love to visit you there.
I see a bunch of my students out there in the audience right now.
What a wonderful group of students from Hawaii. Thanks for joining us. So did they travel here with you? Yes, I wanted to expose them to the mainland culture. Welcome.
Khadijat Rashid.
And also Dr. Khadijat Rashid was here during the protest and was a sophomore at the time. Now she is the interim dean here at Gallaudet University. We're also joined by Dr. Brandan Stern, who teaches government here. I'd also like to take the time now to introduce our moderators for today. Come on down, please. Come on.
Hello there.
We have Kayla Chapman, who is here representing the student body government. She's a fourth-year student, and she is majoring in government. Did I get all of that right?
You did, you did.
Wonderful. Okay, and we also have Topher Gonzalez Avila,
Hi there.
and you're in your first year, sort of, kind of, in the middle of first and second year in the MASLED department. So have fun. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming today. We are thrilled. Let's just dive right into our questions. Are we ready? Queued up with our PowerPoint? Before we begin questioning our panelists, first we have a video to give you a little background on the Deaf President Now movement.
Good afternoon. We're all pretty familiar with the fact that the Deaf President Now movement happened in 1988. But are we really familiar with why? Let me tell you. Gallaudet was established in 1864, and at that time the president was Edward Minor Gallaudet, who was a hearing person. And since that time, the presidents of the university have all been people who can hear. Then, in 1988, there were deaf candidates for the new president. And the faculty, students, and staff were very excited about the possibility that we would have a deaf president finally. But in fact, what happened is that the Board of Trustees had selected 3 finalists. 2 of the finalists were deaf, and 1 could hear. In the end, the Board of Trustees chose the hearing woman as the new president of Gallaudet. The board announced their choice by distributing flyers throughout the campus. When the students saw this, they were enraged, and they knew they would not accept the decision. With that, the students banded together and blocked the gates of the campus, restricting access. students continued to protest for a full week, refusing the selection of the hearing person for the president. They had 4 demands. They're listed here. They said that if these demands were met, they would stop protesting. And in fact, that is what happened. Those demands were met, and the first deaf president of Gallaudet was selected. Of course, all of the faculty, staff, and students were absolutely elated that a deaf president finally was selected for Gallaudet University. It was our victory.
So that is, in brief, a nutshell history of the Deaf President Now movement and our fight for equality. With that primer, I think we're ready to dive into our questions and learn more from your perspectives. First question for all of the panelists. Were you here during the Deaf President Now movement? And if so, what were your experiences navigating the movement as a person of color?
I wasn't here during the movement.
I wasn't here either. I was a bud. I was here for the 2006 movement. Yes, I was here. That night when the students marched. The very next day, I happened to go to a meeting with the students, and I told them that we, the faculty, were raising money to help with getting their ticketing together, and the students were very, very excited. In fact, the chairperson happened to be there, and I opened my mouth, made this suggestion that we fund the effort, and so they asked me to be the chairperson for fundraising at that time, and I did throughout the week, and saw everything happen all throughout the protest. So, and how was it to navigate that as a person of color? Well, it was a very exciting time. One of the most exciting times of my life. I got almost no sleep. My wife ended up forcing me to get some sleep, at least a couple hours here and there, chairing the fundraising efforts. We raised over $40,000, $20,000 in cash that first week, and I carried that money with me. It was under my pillow at my house. I hadn't opened yet a bank account at that time. And so I had thousands of dollars under my pillow in my house. Thank goodness nobody stole any of it. But it was a wonderful experience.
That is wonderful. Were you here during that time?
No.
I was 5 years old. Okay. I'm feeling a little bit old in this moment because I was here and I was a sophomore at the time. And I remember hearing there was, a scuttlebutt about a deaf president or a hearing president. At the time, I was more invested in staying out of trouble. And so I didn't really participate a whole lot in that scuttlebutt. However, there was a point where I started to really think about what was going on and what it meant to me. I was an international student. I had to think about not jeopardizing my support, my visa, and so forth. That was a real concern for me. At the same time, I was friends with Brigetta. There she is, Brigetta Bourne, Furl. And she was one of the student leaders. She was a good friend of mine. She was a good girl too, by the way. And yet there she was, front and center of this whole movement. And I thought, well, maybe I could do this too. After the second or third day, I decided, yes, I was going to fully participate. And I did. And there weren't any classes that week anyway, so there weren't any classes to go to. So I was really heavily involved during the whole week.
Well, as a person of color, how did that whole experience impact you?
Well, for me, there were two experiences because, like I said, I was an international student, and then I also was a person of color. There were a lot of black students at the time, maybe 150 black students, not necessarily students of color. I don't know about the numbers of Hispanic. There weren't many Asian, okay? They had a very similar conflict that I did, questioning the safety of participating, but ultimately deciding to do so. As an international student, I think that was a little bit more nuanced because there were some real dangers involved, possibility of really getting in trouble there. And nonetheless, I still made the choice that I did to participate. But again, for me, it was multi-layered. And in the end, I thought that the priority was about fighting for the civil rights of deaf people, and that I understood this as a once-in-a-lifetime event for me. So
Wow,
I went
wow.
in full force.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Should we go? Oh, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, just before you go on, as I said, I wasn't there during the week. I mean, I wasn't physically here, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't here in spirit. I was in Little Rock. I was home while it was going on. And every evening at the end of the day, I would run home to watch the news. And the story was on the news. The whole world was watching. And I know that a lot of people did that. So perhaps we weren't here, but we were here in spirit, and we supported the movement 1,000%.
Imagine the whole world's eyes riveted to Gallaudet for the protest. An amazing time.
Absolutely. Okay. It's really hard to imagine. Okay, so here are our next set of questions. How did DPN affect race at Gallaudet University and the community there? And also the deaf community. What was the impact there? And specifically the black deaf community. And additionally, looking at what past impacts there have been, look at what has been in the future.
Well, it definitely had an impact on the presence of others in the board for Gallaudet. Prior to DPN, the board was always hearing white men in control of the board. After the Deaf President Now movement, the composition of the board changed. We got more diversity. We had deaf and hard of hearing people there. We had women. We had people of color. The board was much more recognizable here. Prior to the movement, nobody knew who the board members were, really. Nobody knew them. But in terms of how that impacted the deaf community, the black deaf community was affected. Many Gallaudet students went to NBDA. And the members were talking about this. Many of them came here to Gallaudet. So there was recognition that this was radical, vital correction to the interpretation. Well, I wasn't here for the DPN movement, but I remember that time, 1988, and the years following. Gallaudet seemed to be much more aware of diversity, setting up programs for students of color, Black, Latino, and they had their Black History Month the first time in 1989. And so I think there were resounding impacts throughout the history of Gallaudet ever after. And in fact, beyond Gallaudet, I don't think there was that much recognition. And of course, I was 8 at the time, so I don't know what things were like quite then. But I learned about DPN, I guess, in high school and college and saw films on it. And it was amazing for me. It impacted me personally as a deaf person and made me think about my own identity in new ways, made me really think about, and that was in fact part of what brought me to Gallaudet in 2002. Wow, that's a big question. So the Deaf President Now movement, well, as a person of color, I have to say many of us didn't see each other, black, white, Hispanic, everybody was the same in that moment. Because it was such a pivotal moment in deaf history, we were all united regardless of race, or sexual orientation. None of that mattered. Everybody was working together and so respectful of each other at the time. And that may be the only time. Yeah, I don't know if you know, but Wednesday night we had a panel presentation. And many of the DPN leaders were invited to speak in support. In fact, in this very spot, here in the field house. And I was in charge of fundraising for DPN, but I wasn't aware of that. But at that moment, everybody came up on stage, and I remember looking at the stage and seeing it was all white leaders on stage. And I was kind of aghast. And I asked the event coordinator about it. I asked, what's going on? Everybody up there is white? There's not one deaf black leader up there? And it came as a shock to them to realize, oh, we don't have any of those leaders here. There are deaf black leaders just right over there, I said. So we brought some up. And including Al Kuthan, brought more people to get involved. And then, in fact, the DPN task force began to didn't include originally any black people. And they cried that it wasn't racism, but in fact, many people grew up never associating with people of color, so they would not recognize that being the case. In New York City, I grew up with diverse friends, family, and black, Latino, and so it was something that was immediately apparent for me. From that time on, DPN began to include deaf black people. There weren't really any Latinos at the time because there was no deaf Latino or Hispanic association. But in 1991, as I understand it, they had Black History Month. Very shortly after the DPN movement. But that wasn't enough. Now we have Latino History Month and they feel like, it's like rich people throwing breadcrumbs to the poor. These are bit morsels and not really improving things for the people of color that are deaf and black. And there are a great many deaf black people who work here now. And deaf Latinos, not so much at the time. There was just one deaf Latino teacher. And let's see, on the Board of Trustees, since that time, since 1988, they've had 53 different board members. Only one was deaf and Latino. For me, I don't see things having changed that much since '88. We're not doing as much of a better job as we could of ensuring equality.
Very interesting. You mentioned you're from Puerto Rico, is that right?
Yes, my mother and father are from Puerto Rico, but I was born in New York City. And Glenn and I were actually basketball buddies.
It's true. So do you have a perspective that's unique to having a Puerto Rican heritage in this instance?
Well, I grew up in New York City and never really experienced oppression to my mind. And then I came here to Gallaudet. That's when I first encountered and recognized oppression. There were so few deaf Latinos at the time. And there was a faculty organization set up. I made a motion that we should join, bring in and bring attention to deaf Latino issues, and the faculty association gave it no regard. They tended to say that it was an issue, but not a critical one. It wasn't one they were going to recognize at the time.
Thank you for that. Can we arrange ourselves so we can see each other a little bit better? Is that good? Yeah. All right. So I'm thinking about my responses a lot. I think, he shared a lot about what I would say about the impact of race on DPN. There was a question that was often asked during that time, which is, are you deaf first or are you black first? or a woman first? You know, these were questions that were asked very often. I think now people know a little bit better, right? And that question is asked a little bit less. But it's almost as if that question was asked to determine who you were most loyal to. And I think we were really trying to make an attempt that being deaf was the way that we were unified, and therefore all other identities were less important. Okay, as a black community, we had to push back, though, okay? If I walk into a room on this campus, the first thing you're thinking about me is that I'm black, not that I'm deaf, okay? So we pushed back. And then also as a woman, I have to say, I'm sorry, you definitely see me as a woman. So why am I being forced to say I'm one or the other more than one or the other? And now we have a better understanding of how these things intersect, and we don't need to necessarily say one is more dominant than another. Now, however, for the community, I understand, you know, that there was community building involved, and the same thing happened for the black deaf community. You know, he talked about the fact that there were a few Hispanic, and that may be true. For us, there really was something inspiriting about the whole event. It also was a time where we stepped up for ourselves, and we did make ourselves more visible, and we did change things. For me personally, let me share this. Just before the protest happened, I had gotten a job, you know, a student job, okay? And on that job, I noticed that I was being asked to do a lot, that the demand was pretty high. And, oh, okay, I understood what that was. I was that person who could check off a lot of boxes for people. I was a student, I was a minority, I was a woman, and so forth. So that has some positive elements because there's some recognition of the fact that you need to include diversity. But I think it's important that we recognize that sometimes it's hard on these people who are getting chosen as the role models or the representatives of the community. So I do think there's more awareness, and I do think that DPN helped increase that in our community, also outside of our community, about gay rights, disabled rights, transgender people rights, immigration rights. I think it's all part of the same movement forward of humanity. So two really important issues, okay? One is student enrollment. I was a senior in 1968. I was black. People of color at the time were very much in minority. You could count them on a single hand. Okay, so you say in 1988 there was about 150. Okay, when you have 1,000 students, 150, you can do the math. Now we're in 2018, okay, and there are more people of color on this campus. There have been some shifts. Secondly, the Gallaudet admission statement has changed, right? And it says that Gallaudet is a bilingual, diverse, multicultural institution of higher education. So that language is in our mission. Okay, but we need some data. Are we accomplishing that mission? Are we doing what we say we want to do? This is a very important question for us to ask.
I also want to emphasize what you were saying about the time of the movement itself. In DPN, there was this sense of unity. It was, in many ways, a beautiful time in our deaf history. But the moment DPN ended, it went back to business as usual. As one example, I received a phone call, and it was a TTY call back in the day, from a very, very popular bar, Tracks, it was called. And they were offering to have a fundraising event there, free, at no cost. And I thought, what a fantastic idea. What a great place to host a celebration. So we were going to go celebrate the new president there. I proposed that to the new president, and it was immediately squelched. They said because it was a gay and lesbian establishment. But gay and lesbian people were involved in the effort to make you president, I told them. But we were told we couldn't do it. DPN was wonderful, and it was a moment of unity, but it was a moment. Because after that, everything went back to business as usual. We've got to get that spirit back where everyone is working for everyone, regardless of race, sexual orientation, gender. You know, we're deaf people. We should all be working together to improve all of our lives.
I agree. Thank you so much for those comments.
Well, during DPN, of course, I wasn't there, but I get why that sense of unity prevailed, the importance of that moment, of getting a deaf president. For me, I think there's also great import in respecting multiple cultures, recognizing the differences and things that across cultures that are so important. But we also have systemic oppression happening. It's always been happening, and it will continue to happen until we address it. Here at Gallaudet, we were established in 1864, and that's all well and good. But look at when Black deaf students were here, or Latino deaf students. There were none of them. And so if you went to a school for the deaf, you heard about Gallaudet, and that's how you came to Gallaudet, but many of the people who came into Gallaudet were, for so much of its history, white people. So when we talk about this deaf history, we're largely talking about white deaf history.
That's right.
And so I think there's been a history of marginalizing people and you know, prohibiting people from easy entrance into Gallaudet. And Gallaudet also is part of educational institutions that systemically have been and historically have been segregated. There have been Black deaf schools that have maxed out at 8th grade. So they were ineligible for entrance into college by and large. So they're already built into the system at its root things to prohibit Black people from advancing in the deaf community and to favor white deaf people. The system is still in operation. We have to examine that system. It takes a great deal of regard to really take a deep look at all of those issues. And it's so important that deaf people see each other as deaf and worthy of unifying, but we cannot lift one up without lifting all of us. And so, you know, look at the people that are lifted up by the movement. Are they largely just men? Are they all of one race? Are they all of one gender and orientation?
I agree with you. And we understand that change takes time, which means we need to be vigilant. We need to be sure that our youth really are learning and advancing. We haven't really heard from Brandan Stern yet. My perspective is as a political scientist. And I have one story that you may have all heard. It's about the 6 men who were blindfolded, right? 6 men who were blindfolded encountering an elephant, right? One encounters the leg and he's the trunk, right? And he thinks it's the trunk of a tree, and then he sees, oh, it's the leg of the elephant, right? And this happens with all of the other blind men, too. And I think that's what DPN is, right? So to answer this question, you know, it's important that we not answer it in a vacuum. It's important that we understand what the national climate was around race at the time. What was the political climate and culture at the time? And here's a simple way of looking at it, okay? In that time, during the protest in 1988, generally, both liberals and conservatives supported the protest, okay? And, you know, and then it was continued to be supported by Democrats, right? Okay? And then DPN happened. Let's say it happened now, okay? With the partisanship that we have right now, with the tribalism that we have right now going on, the national conversation about race is very different than it was at the time. So I think it's important that we really look at that larger context when having this discussion. Yeah, I took a class on civil movements, and in that I was encouraged to take that stance that Dr. Stern is talking about, to take a few steps back and see the experience in context, to see what all of the different parts of the experience were. So I'm always very curious about that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next question.
Looking at the number of marginalized groups, Latinos, LGBT, Black people, and the civil rights movements of all of those groups, DPN can be an inspiration to all of us. But we have still not reached that state of equality. So given this history, what are your perspectives on how the Deaf President Now movement can be capitalized on to further social justice movements for all the marginalized groups within the deaf community?
It's a model, right? It's a model that we can look at when we're thinking about how to fight for our rights. I know that the community in Arkansas was impacted. I wrote a letter one time explaining exactly what that impact looked like. State administrators were hiring interpreters. And at the time, those interpreters weren't certified, they weren't properly trained. And what that did was demonstrate a lack of respect for the deaf community, right? So the community came together, worked with the Association of the Deaf, also worked with the Professional Interpreting Agency, as well as some lawyers. We were able to force those state agencies to change their practices. That all happened as a result of DPN. That was our model. That was the thing that told us that we did not have to accept things as they are, and that we can mobilize and that we can change things.
Well, for me, I think the whole deaf community at large looks to Gallaudet. So one place we have to begin those changes is here at Gallaudet. Back in 1988 now, if we look at that 30-year span, there's only been one deaf Latino on the board. And a few Black deaf people have sat on the board, Dr. Glenn Anderson has. But to change the attitudes, and the notion that deaf Latinos aren't important to pay attention to. Just as one example, back in 1988, we changed the composition of the board. And then, 5 or 6 years later, I remember asking the Board of Trustees why they didn't yet have a deaf Latino on the board. And the response I got was, oh, we do, we have Latinos on the board, we do. And when I inquired about who that was, they told me a name, and it was a hearing person. And I responded back that I was stressing the need for a deaf Latino there because they could speak to the needs of deaf Latinos. They thought that hearing person could, but in fact we had to fight to change that notion in the board. The notion that hearing people could speak for deaf people at all. Deaf people must represent deaf people. Black deaf people must represent Black deaf people. We must have those kinds of representation for our communities. So they said, Angel, you just don't understand. We have to have people on the board with the skills and knowledge it needs. I was shocked. I could not believe it, that same old argument of hearing people on the board. They used to inhibit any presence of deaf people on the board. So now, reframing that question to the board, why in 30 years have we only had one deaf Latino on the board? Where is our representation? You've got to start the change right there. Also, look at the presidency of Gallaudet. You are so very fortunate to have President Cordano. And I say that because people who have experienced oppression can react in more than one way. One is to try to stop the oppression, to work to change it. Some people will go with that and begin to oppress others because of their experience of oppression. Dr. Cordano is one of those who works to change Gallaudet for the better. But Dr. Cordano only has President Cordano only has limited powers to change things. It takes also the board, it takes also the whole community to fix that, to fix racism here. The president is limited in their power. All of us have to work together. Black deaf communities, Latino deaf communities, Asian deaf communities, we always have to go together to work and find that spirit of DPN and create change here.
I don't know if you've seen the phrase, you got to break eggs to make an omelet. Also, if you know the movement, nevertheless, she persists, talking about breaking rules and making things happen, right? And looking to that for inspiration. We can also look to DPN for inspiration. Sure, we have laws and we have rules, but they were broken during the protest, right? They were broken to get something done. And our frame of justice and how we see that is complicated. It's messy, right? Justice and civil rights are not a given. They're taken. They're earned. So I think those are things important to remember about the movement.
Well, what occurs to me is, from this question, is the need for social justice. Social justice is justice for everyone. And by that, I mean that Deaf President now centered deafness, and we looked at why a deaf person who was qualified was not chosen and not given the chance. And we worked to create that change over that week and, in fact, accomplished it. But that was only on one axis. If we're looking at social justice today, we have to think about it in the frames of the diverse community we have. That fight's not easy. It takes each of us examining our own privileges, examining our own oppressions, and being ready to confront them. We can see DPN as an inspiration in how to work together and unify for a need, but that process takes time. It takes persistent collaboration, and it takes the ability to disagree and persist. And yes, as you said, it can be messy, but if we keep working towards that goal, towards that aim, then we can add to the spirit of DPN and add multiple identities to that work.
I think what I have to add to that is, as Brandan said, DPN didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed in a context within this country. And we have to remember that we existed within a city, DC, and the campus exists inside neighborhoods. But all of these people supported us. They drove by and they honked. The whole city, all of these hearing people supported us. Throughout the country, we got calls, we got letters, we got students from other universities, the 12 colleges and universities in the area, all stood in support of us. So we talk about it being a deaf movement, but sometimes that's an insular way to see it. And I think it's important that we understand how we exist within that larger context and how they impact one another. That sure, we had a movement, but it did not exist in a vacuum. We got a lot of support. And the same applies when working for social justice. That it goes both ways, and we need to make sure that we are perceiving things and including the full picture. I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
Mm-hmm. You know, in fact, it reminds me of the analogy of the bridge. It takes spanning two sides of a chasm to create a bridge. And there were protests for 9 days last week with, but Gallaudet's support was not present immediately in those supports across the country. Moving on to our next question.
So, in the 1960s, the civil rights movement was a foundational one for a lot of African American history and black studies. And it's been argued that DPN should be foundational for the modern deaf history and studies movement, but it's not. So why do you think that is, and what do you think is missing? I think some of it is about individual choice as an educator. When I teach, I cover DPN, I cover the movement, and I make sure to remind students. So as an educator, I see that as a responsibility. And so that's my opinion.
I remember when I came to Gallaudet and began to learn about DPN. I came in a summer program, and I remember hearing students who talked about Deaf President Now because they'd had the chance to learn about it in ASL classes they took. And I was thinking, well, you know, these students knew a great deal about it. And like you said, I think that it was largely dismissed by some of my educators. Other reasons it's not centered might be that it has to do with the teacher. How many deaf teachers did we have then? How many do we have now? How many know the importance of including it in our history? And how many think other things are more important and have primacy? I'm not sure of the reason that happens, but I know in Black history, I started taking Black history in high school. And in that time, I went to a predominantly black school, so I did have the chance to learn much during that time, not just about the 1960s black history, but prior to that. So then when I went into college, I was interested in continuing my studies of black history, and in fact, looking at black history the world over, which gave me a greater appreciation for the area. Because I think that curriculum doesn't look at just a moment in time, just the civil rights movement and outside of the context of its history. In 1870, there was an amendment to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were just after the Civil War. And of course, there was a great deal of resistance to all of this and to the oppression we've had. But the struggle has continued throughout time because these issues are integral to the fabric of our society. And it takes a great deal to resist that kind of oppression, and which exists almost as a given in the fabric of our society. So in deaf studies, to be quite honest, as I see it, there are a number of things that still need to be included in the teaching of deaf history. And we have to preserve history. I think it's so important to look at it, not see it as obsolete and unconnected to our current and future lives. That's critical understanding to have. I would say fear. Fear, fear. Those are the reasons it's not taught. And you all know I wrote a book on this, and there are many schools for the deaf out there that do not teach the movement to their students. This is part of our deaf history and such an important part of it. And they don't do it. Almost no schools are using this text or really doing anything to teach the Deaf President Now movement with any depth. I think that has to do with fear. Fear that students will learn how to protest. Fear that those students will learn how to protest and create change in their own schools. Where was the 20th anniversary of the Deaf President Now movement? Anybody? Anybody remember where that was? Where was the 20th anniversary? In fact, the 20th anniversary should have been celebrated, but the Board of Trustees didn't want to. The president of Gallaudet at the time didn't want to. The Alumni Association at the time didn't want to.
Oh, really?
The NAD didn't want to. I am flabbergasted that the 20th anniversary was not a mark of celebration. And I contacted the student leaders. Oh, hello, I see you over there. And they were all in agreement that there should have been recognition and celebration at that 20-year mark for the deaf community, for myself, for the deaf leaders of that movement. We all celebrated it. It was a moment of great success, but I think there's been a great deal of fear that has stymied that celebration. DPN was one of the most peaceful protests. It was one of the most peaceful protest movements in the United States history. There were no arrests. There was no property damage. I think it's just been fear. And so it's time to get rid of that fear and begin to teach our students their history and teach our students how to create change, how to work together to create change. Dr. Rashid?
I approach this from a different angle. Does anybody in the audience know how many deaf people, meaning community deaf people, are in the United States? Anybody have an idea? You're saying 11 million?
That's a lot.
300,000, 1 million, or some of the guesses out there, 750,000. So, in this room, 300,000 to 11 million, nobody really knows, right? Okay. The best estimate about how many people are in our community, and this is from a VR company, okay, and is about 500,000, okay? Definitely less than 1 million, okay? This being the case, here's my point, okay? I'm a mathematician, so forgive me, but how they, in the census, deaf people are really not measured, right? Even though I've suggested it for many, many years, that they include that in the census. But they don't, because it's so small. You're talking about, you know, we have 318 million people in the United States, right? And if we're talking about something between 300 and 500,000, what percentage is that? It's not even one, right? It's a modicum, right? It's the tiniest population. Now compare that with the black population, with the Latino population, with 13% of people, 15% of people, and all these populations are growing. But the population of deaf people really isn't, and it's a very, very small number. And that's something that counts against the movement. And here the question is African American history. Okay, African American history, right? You know, black people were here long before this place became a country, right? And that was the case with deaf people too, perhaps not as many, and they were probably isolated, right? So they weren't as visible. And in that time, there wasn't really a deaf language, you know? In the 60s is when we claimed that language. So again, when you talk about history, history is very large, and it's going to take time to understand the ultimate impact, right? And the possible reasons of that. Again, I think it's very important that we be seen and we get counted. And until we do, the fact that we're such a small number is really a disadvantage.
If I can, related to that, I'm working on an article with somebody regarding exactly that, the numbers of deaf people. In fact, this research looks at those deaf families. How many deaf people are there in any population is a difficult thing to determine. And so we're hoping to be able to find those numbers through health surveys. And so looking through the CDC and their data, that's a little bit easier to identify because they have, in the National Health Interview Survey, the NHIS data, they do have questions about people's communication, about the state of their hearing and so forth. So it's a little easier to mine for that data, and we can weight the responses so that we're not counting every person who responded with some hearing difference, but we're able to more properly estimate whether it's 3 million people with hearing difference. But in the U.S. Census, I think the count is less reliable, and they don't also have questions about the communication of people, which they do in the NHIS data, which is imperfect, but still a better way of perhaps answering that question than asking how many people don't hear this. And of course, some phrase it as having hearing troubles, hearing difficulties, things like that, and they don't target those questions about identity and culture. So you're right, it does seem to be the case that having greater numbers grants one greater visibility and more power, but we're ways off from that.
And I think I might be one of those very unusual people in the United States who actually gets excited by receiving the census. Most people aren't, but I am. You know, I'm very curious about the questions they ask or don't ask that I think they ought to, but and this is a fight. This is a fight for us to get included in the count so that we are seen.
So you were talking about the very small number of deaf people, and I don't remember the year, but I know it was in the 2000s. Rachel Harris, a professor that was here at the time, was involved in a big project on American Sign Language and found that it was the third most taught language in the country. And it had previously been ranked fourth, but with all of this data, being able to contact them, we found that we'd rose in the rankings. ASL has still not recognized as a language and taught to deaf people. It's not always recognized as a foreign language in educational institutions, so I can see there are problems yet to be faced.
I'd like to build on what the other panelists have said before me. DPN is part of the conversation. It's not the conversation. You know, when I talk about this with students, and we talk about SELMA, right, which is a civil rights movement, right, and perhaps foundational, right, I'm so amazed at how many students are unfamiliar with that event, okay? So we need to learn more about our lived experiences through learning about other people's lived experiences. Recently, I was reading that Martin Luther King, where he lived, when he lived, he really only had support from about 30% of the population. And in spite of that, he continued, right? Now, that favorability would be very different today, right? In DPN, remember, during that time, a lot of people weren't agreeing on terminology like public order or authority or status quo or getting consensus before we move ahead, okay? But they didn't wait for that. They kept moving, okay? That happened in Selma as well, right? The movement continued. So we can't just study DPN. We need to study other similar movements. We need to identify the themes around humanity through that, and that's how we're going to learn.
And I'm not sure where this might be recorded, but I think we need to have great respect for history. And very often people don't have that respect for it. They don't see their experiences now being connected to those histories. But when you can show those links, see those links, you see how systems run. And I think it gives us a greater appreciation for history rather than studying it as an abstraction of events that happen in a time and a place. If we look at how those events connect to the lived moment now, how those systems have been and continue to be in operation, I think that creates a greater conversation about the history.
You're right, and we've all heard history repeats itself. And we also have to be aware of how we're being perceived by the larger community, especially Congress and those who fund our programs. It's important also that public education programs include information about our movement and our history, and deaf studies.
Agreed, but again, history depends on who gets to write it. You know, whether or not people are describing history as it really occurred or as they'd like to see history. If we look at the history of slavery and how it's depicted, if you look at current textbooks covering slavery, they often say black people voluntarily came over to the United States. Voluntarily, no way. They were in chains and shackled and took a long time to get here and endured abuse. How can they possibly avoid that in the discussion of slavery? And they refer to people as the people that cared for the slaves were their caretakers. I think there are ways that they try to obfuscate the true nature of the history of slavery in text today. And we've got to push back against all of that.
So you ask here, what's missing? So I'm going to answer that. I am hoping that we actually have a museum dedicated to the movement and the larger history of deaf people and the culture of deaf people and our civil rights movement. That's what I'm hoping for us.
Agreed.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next question.
It has been stated that, and looking at the intersections of race and the deaf president now, many people have said that race wasn't as critical, but we know from our documentation that there were at least 150 black deaf students here at the time. Do you think that they were largely invisible? What do you think happened with recognition of those students?
I think both are true. I do. I think they were not seen and marginalized. I mean, it was 88. So I think both are true. I think we weren't that visible. I think that that's part of it. And you told that story about when they got the leaders up on stage, they didn't include any people of color. And now, I don't think that would happen again, because the population here now, the students are more than half of color. So I think it's a little bit harder to get missed these days at Gallaudet.
We're here. We're here. Black deaf people are here. Deaf Latinos are here. There are beautiful pictures of of black deaf people protesting, of deaf Latinos protesting. But remember, the deaf president now protests weren't just made up of Gallaudet students. It was part of the national community. Outside community members came here too in support of our students. Students from NTID traveled to be part of it. It was huge, this huge group of people that converged on Gallaudet for this. Gallaudet faculty, black, Latino. At the time, I don't think we were seen because there was this sense of unity. We're all working together.
We were also looking at media and some articles. There was one Vision something or other. What was that? Where they talked about the 3 students who were of color. That's right, that's what it was, Voice, thank you, yeah. there was a publication called Voice, and the front page had 3 students of color. You know, that was especially delightful for me because all of the images I have seen have been white people. And was it because they weren't there, or that's because where the cameras went?
I'll also add that many of you may remember the Martin Luther King banner that we were allowed to use for our march. We still have a dream. So we were able to use that. And the DPN task force, we never called them and asked them if we could use that. They offered that from the museum. They called to us and asked, and there you see that image. The museum approached us and asked us if we would like to use that banner for our march. That's amazing. That is never been loaned to a non-black group. And it's definitely never been loaned to students who might damage it. But they were incredibly gracious in loaning us that banner.
Which museum was that?
Oh, see there, the Martin Luther King banner, "We Still Have a Dream"? That was astounding. It shows how much support we had from black people, from Latino people, who were there in support of our fight for a deaf president.
And remember, the neighborhood at time, by the way, looked very different than it does today. There were a lot more black people who lived in our neighborhoods at the time. I would say virtually 100%, pretty much. And for a long time, the relationship between Gallaudet and the neighboring communities were not friendly. They had a lot of complaints about the loud partying Gallaudet students. And during the protest, however, a lot of that changed. A lot of that shifted. They were very present to our cause, very supportive of the university. And when they were interviewed, they were able to see the connection between what deaf people were doing here and the civil rights movement for black people. And they said as much, and that's why they were in support of the movement. In my dissertation, I did some research, and I found a quote that I hadn't seen before, and it was from one of our neighbors in the 1988 protest. And that neighbor said, "Hey, the last time I saw this kind of energy was with the Black Panthers." And so I think that is what you're talking about. That was how they related to us. You're right, and previous to that, the wall was a very felt wall between the campus and the neighborhoods.
And I think a lot of people say that there weren't that many black students at the time. And the question has been posed about whether they were just invisible. Well, for a number of reasons. I would say the media representation and media gaze, where it went, was important. If you look at the Parkland shooting in Florida, there were so many students involved in the protest, but look at who was centered. Look at where the gaze fell when POC had something to say. I think they kept the gaze on the same kind of person over and over in the media blitz for that. I think media has a preference for who they think looks good, who will represent a movement for them, who will be looked on favorably. And so I think media plays a role in that depiction. That's my first point. Secondly, I'd also say that, once again, I don't know what the case was for 1988 and 1989, but what I have heard time and again from those who were here, and I was here from 2002 to 2010, and I know students who have been here since that time, many still feel unwelcome here. They don't feel that sense of belonging. They come here to learn, to get their education, to navigate their degree, but they're not made to feel like this is their home. We've got to question why that's the case. Why would they not feel like this is home? To be honest, I don't feel like Gallaudet's home either. I mean, I had different experiences here, a number of stumbling blocks, but I persisted, and part of that was because of my characteristics. I didn't go to a school for the deaf, and I'm deaf, but anybody who comes from Gallaudet, and from the lineage of Gallaudet students doesn't necessarily approach those who don't in the same way. I'm thankful to Gallaudet for the opportunities I've gotten, but I don't have that gut sense of Gallaudet is inevitably and always home for me. And so I can't speak for others, but I do want to speak this to you. Sure.
I felt the same way when I came in here for my doctoral program in '84. There were no Hispanic deaf teachers anywhere. Bob Davila was on campus with the pre-college, but I was the only one here at the university. I started to have meetings at my house for the deaf Hispanic students or deaf Latino students who came here. Just yesterday I met with the deaf Latino group here, and it seems not too much has changed, other than having a few more Latino students. But we still only have one Latino faculty member, one administrator. So where are the role models for this population? How are we to expect them to feel at home? So I feel differently when I'm here in the mainland versus Hawaii. Here I feel like a minority. When I go to Hawaii, I feel like I'm part of the community. Everyone has Japanese heritage or Filipino heritage, and the white population there is very small, so it's kind of flipped. And as a result, I feel very much at home there. And I think that's what we need to create here. That's what we need to change. People of color does not mean black only. It means Latino, it means Asian, and it means making everybody feel at home. We are winding down here. We have just a few minutes left.
And this has been an amazing discussion. Do any of you have any closing remarks before we finish up our event? Well, I have one more thing to say. That Dr. Rashid was talking about the support of the community and the surrounding community. And for all of us, we have to remember that deaf rights doesn't mean deaf people only. Deaf and hearing have to work together. DPN may not have been able to happen if it weren't for hearing allies. I think working together we can make more happen. That's one of the other lessons of DPN, is working together we can achieve more.
Anybody else?
Well, I would say that if we're going to pursue social justice, we have to think about how we open up that discussion of intersectionality. Because I think it's so often assumed that that merely means recognizing multiple identities. But I think we also tend to forget about the structural racism and oppression that comes with that. I think we have to talk about how that plays out. Look at how systems operate, how we dismantle systems of oppression. That creates greater change for people. And rather than looking at only lifting your own group identity from the state of oppression, we have to look at everyone's experience of oppression. And look at all these narratives, discover from that what we can change for all of us. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your honesty and candor in looking at these issues and the differences in the gaze of people on these intersections. And if I could draw your attention to the quote on the screen. I, for example, grew up with this sense of what my identities are. Mexican, deaf, international, and multiple kinds of identities, queer, and so forth. And learning how to exist with multiple identities, how they all work in tandem is really important. How these things work can provide multiple axes of oppression and multiple axes of privilege. I think all of that's important to examine. My advice to all of you, other than what I've already told you, is you definitely get more deaf Latinos on your board, but also set up scholarships for people of color. I came to Gallaudet because I had a free scholarship for the doctoral program. Without that scholarship, I wouldn't have been here. And I wouldn't be Dr. Angel Ramos. I thank God for having given me the opportunity to come to Gallaudet with that scholarship and obtain my PhD. But that's just me. That's one person. We need a lot more support for other deaf people of color out there. And some of that support is in the form of scholarships. Those will bring Deaf POC here. That's one of my suggestions. First of all, I want to thank our outstanding student moderators. Great job, great job. And I'd like to bring President Cordano to the stage for a few closing remarks.
Thank you so much for your words of wisdom and leading the community in this discussion. We very much value you. So I have a few takeaways from watching today. Just today at lunch, I was sitting in the JSAC and I saw banners for the SBG candidates, a diversity banner, and we were the number 3 team. Okay. And we can't really remember the last time that happened. In fact, we had this vision to have this conversation because we know that's what Gallaudet is about. We are a learning community. We are moving. And in order to do that, we need to talk. We need to have a dialogue. And we need to be willing every day to ask questions, to think about these questions, to have conversations, and to really attend, right? In that moment of the protest, people weren't listening to each other, right? They were not listening. They were not attending. And that's a skill that each of us need to practice on every level of Gallaudet and in our communities. On a daily basis, we need to make sure we're truly understanding and attending. And it has been my absolute privilege to do that today with you. And as president of Gallaudet, I'd like to just take a moment to notice and acknowledge my pain and of others in the room, to acknowledge that suffering does happen here at Gallaudet. So, Unhill, I want to acknowledge, I see that you found your place of healing, but I also feel the pain as a young person just beginning their life, right? So someday, I hope that Gallaudet will feel like your home, too.
Wonderful, thank you. And I also have to thank the President's office, the Provost's office, and the Dean's office, and the Public Relations office for supporting this event and helping make sure it happens. And we are very proud to have presented this series on unsung heroes of the DPN movement, and our student interns have done a great deal of work to make this happen. And our secretary has been invaluable in bringing this event to fruition, and we are so thankful to have had all of the support to bring this conversation on DPN and race to all of you. Thank you.